How did Noah inform people living all over the world that the flood was going to happen? Well, there are a lot of things going on in this flood narrative beyond just the surface reading of the text. Now, the surface reading of the text makes it seem like a big, giant global flood. But we're going to get into some nuances of the text, as well as some ancient rabbinic knowledge about it that says that it actually wasn't a global flood. First, let's get into what the rabbinic literature says about Noah's flood before we get into a deeper understanding of what the text in the Bible says about the flood narrative. There's a lot of entries within the Midrashic literature that suggest that Noah's flood was localized. One entry says that the area where Jerusalem is was never under the floodwaters. There's another Midrashic entry that says that there were lands far away from where the flood was, where nothing was ever underwater and the people there were never drowned. Another Midrashic entry says that the floodwaters, once the floods were all done, was only about knee deep. In other words, the water was not like 20 feet over the tallest mountains. By the way, that's a problem in the plain reading of the text. Now we understand that it was not necessarily seen as a global earth-wide catastrophe covering Mount Everest with 20 feet of water above the peak of Mount Everest. We can now look at some nuances in the biblical text itself. Now, whenever the scriptures say the whole world was flooded, that doesn't necessarily mean the entire earth. From an ancient perspective, the understanding of the whole world was the amount of the earth that they had surveyed, the amount of the earth that they were familiar with. Oftentimes in the ancient maps, they would draw what they knew, and then they would draw dragons and monsters and things like that past what they knew, representing the unknown. So the whole world from an ancient person's perspective was the amount of the world that they were aware of. The next nuance we need to look at and consider that says that the world was probably, or that the flood was probably not an entire global catastrophe, is when we consider that the mountains were buried under 20 feet of water. Well, not every mountain could have been buried under 20 feet of water above its peak, because some mountains are this low, other mountains are this high. So that means most of the mountains, like Mount Everest, if there was 20 feet of water above the peak of Mount Everest, there's mountains significantly smaller, which means they could have had hundreds to 500,000 feet of water above them. So it makes no sense to say the mountains were covered to 20 feet of water. When we look at the word mountain as it's used in biblical symbology, we see that mountains often refer to human powers and authorities like kings and governments and things like that. So when it says that the mountains were buried or covered by 20 feet of water, could simply just be saying that all human authority, governments, kings, powers were completely wiped out, that they were drowned in the flood. It has nothing to do with an actual literal drowning of geography. Another thing that you need to take note of is the dove, when it was sent out, the dove went out and found an olive leaf and brought it back, and that's when Noah knew it was safe to exit the ark. The thing is if the entire earth was deluged and it was buried to 20 feet of water above the highest mountain, well, you got a problem there, because there wouldn't have been an olive tree left to have a branch on it that quickly. There just wouldn't have been an olive tree for the dove to pluck a branch from. So there had to be some area where there were still olive trees growing that wasn't under the floodwaters. Another nuance about the way the text is read is it says God caused a wind to come through to blow the waters away. Well, if it was a global flood with Mount Everest being under 20 feet of water, a wind would not have blown the waters away. It just wouldn't have happened. And so if it was a localized flood, some winds coming through could sit there and, blow the waters away to another basin, thereby lowering the overall floodwater levels. Like I said, that one rabbi said they're only 3 feet deep. Once the actual flood activity stopped, it was only 3 feet deep. So as you can see, if it was a localized flood, as the rabbis suggest, and a deeper reading of the text suggests, then there would be no need to inform the people in other parts of the world. And as a result, this is also why we understand that there are other cultures who have accountings of the Great Flood. Indian culture has an accounting of the flood. We have the Epic of Gilgamesh. There are accounts of the Great Flood of Noah all over the world. So anyhow, but that's why he didn't even have to go inform people in other parts of the world, because they weren't flooded under the floodwaters.